second thing I just want to talk to you about this afternoon is education. Because if you go and take a step back, there's two things happening in the education system in New Zealand, and I think that you should have concerns about both of them actually. So the first part is that we worry a lot about the 20% of New Zealanders who leave school with hopelessly inadequate literacy and numeracy skills. And I want to come back on that in a second. But if you take the other 80%, actually they're coming out with a world-class education. If you look at the PISA studies on education in New Zealand, what they show you is there's quite a lot of variation within the schools, and there's quite a lot of variation from school to school, but by and large, New Zealanders are coming out with a world-class education. That is why our people are in such great international demand. So I worry about the fact that, I worry about the 20% that can't read and write properly, but I worry about making sure that for the 80% that we can, we're actually delivering them the opportunities to want to stay in New Zealand. Yes, by and large, we're actually a good place to raise a family. Yes, by and large, we've got a nice environment, we've got a good place to live. But are we really providing them the opportunities that mean they're going to stay here? And if they're not, what does that mean for families when grandparents live in New Zealand and their kids and their grandkids live in another country? And we shouldn't kid ourselves about how much of that is happening. 1 in 4 people that have been to university have now left. Probably the largest iwi that this country's got is in Sydney. You know, people are leaving. And they're leaving because they don't see the financial opportunities to earn the incomes to provide for their families and to do well. And I think we've got to really focus on that part of it. But I want to go back to the 20% because there was a story in this morning's paper and the New Zealand Herald basically saying that we should delay national standards and that we shouldn't be as aggressive in national standards. I want to tell you one thing. We should be incredibly demanding about what comes out of every school in New Zealand. It's a disgrace that 20% of young people can't read and write properly. We're robbing them of any future opportunity they might ever have. And if you can't read and write, you will not be able to be part of the modern economy as we know it. It doesn't matter what job you're doing. I mean, even if you just have to read the map to get to the job opportunity. So we've come up with a thing called national standards, and we, in very plain English, from the start of next year, are going to measure every child from age 5. We're going to report to those parents in absolutely plain English, in a report that they can understand. It'll have a little picture and it'll say, this is where the national standard is, this is where your child is. If they're below the national standard, this is what we're doing to get your child above the national standard. If they're above the national standard, this is what we're doing to extend them. And you should be absolutely demanding of those schools and of those principals and of getting that information. I'll tell you why I say that. In the last 3 or 4 months, I've been having a number of meetings around the country. So one of them I had on a number of occasions in Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch was with principals who were from schools that were primarily low decile schools, a lot of them from South Auckland and Porirua and other parts of New Zealand, that are actually doing really well, because there's some fantastic schools out there in low decile areas that are just knocking it out of the park. So why is that happening compared to a lot of schools that are not necessarily delivering those results? This is the answer. Those schools that are succeeding measure and monitor and report on those children. It is not rocket science. Okay, they work out what the child is doing, they work out whether the teacher is getting through, they're educating the teachers and lifting the bar and lifting performance, and they're absolutely demanding. It is nonsense that if a child comes from a poor household, they can't learn. It's just a cop-out that we say that they're poor little brown kids and they can't learn because they're poor or because they're Maori or because they're Pacific Island. It's nonsense. And those schools actually prove that. And the only way we're going to have an economy which actually competes in the 21st century and does well is when every New Zealander can participate. And they can only participate if they get an opportunity through education. And we've just got to put the acid back on and make sure that those schools perform right across the country. We owe it to those kids. You know, that's the single most important thing that can happen. I mean, I grew up in a state house brought up by a solo mother. Okay? So, you know, and I've become Prime Minister of New Zealand. Why? Because my mother, 2 things actually. We might have been economically poor, but there was a lot of love in our household. And the second thing was, my mother really valued education. She was absolutely demanding that I was going to get a good education, that I'd do my homework, that I'd be engaged in what was going on, and that I believed in myself. And that's the attitude that we've got to have coming through those schools in New Zealand. Now, a lot of them we do, but not all of them we do. And unless we measure and monitor and report what's going on, we're not going to change attitudes and we're not going to improve those kids. And I think that we should just really, really be engaged in that space. So that's one thing that we're doing. The second thing I'd say to you is that I actually think we've got to tackle some of the hard issues that are out there. One of them is drugs.
Yep.
It's a very serious issue. When I get engaged in issues and really start looking at them, then you start saying, you know, what are the things that are crucially important? Well, the fact that we have got a society which is using P at a much greater rate than a lot of other countries is something we have to do something about. And in October, I'm going to give a speech which is going to be much more broad-ranging, actually, in some of the solutions to tackling that. Can we eradicate the drugs culture in New Zealand? Well, I wish we could. Is it easy? No. I don't think anyone's arguing it's easy. We're up against some real challenges. I mean, we can only, at this stage, undertake surveillance of a certain number of containers that come into New Zealand. So through our seaports, we're quite exposed where drugs do come through. But we're getting better at understanding where those risk areas are and undertaking surveillance. But you can go to China and buy contact NT, which is pseudoephedrine. It's not limited in the demand or limited in how much you can buy. It's not illegal. And so you've got people who've got a lot of financial incentive to send that out. So yes, we've got to look at the precursors of drugs. We've also got to look at the way we deal with the people at the forefront of the manufacture and distribution of drugs, namely gangs. And the Parliament's got to give the police and the judiciary much greater powers to clamp down on that. Much greater powers of surveillance, much greater powers of seizure, much greater powers in terms of taking those resources off people. And the Parliament's got a series of different laws that we're looking at that we've introduced to get tough in that sort of area. We've also got to look at rehabilitation. I mean, in the end, it's about cutting supply, but it's also about cutting demand. One of the things I want to talk about in that area is how do you cut demand? Well, partly you've got to get to a point where people don't want to do that. You know, when they actually see a purpose in what they're doing. And we've done a few things which have got very little media coverage, but I'm actually personally quite proud of. A few weeks ago, we announced for kids that come from low socioeconomic groups, we're going to fund 30,000 places for holiday programs. Because the reality is I can send our children, I can send Max and Steffi off to a holiday program and they go. We can afford it and it makes no difference. But there's a hell of a lot of kids out there that come from families where there just isn't enough money. And so what are you left with? You're left with holidays where the children don't necessarily have anywhere to go. Half the time the parents may not even be there in the home. And we wonder why they wander around the communities and get themselves into trouble. Whereas we've got real opportunities to not only encourage them, but to give them some purpose. And I go around a lot of schools. I mean, when we did the announcement for this, we actually did it at a Decile 1 school in South Auckland. And just talking to the teachers said, look, these kids are great. They're really lovely kids. They try really hard. They do well. But when the holidays come around, they actually don't want to be there. They actually don't want to be on holiday because no one's at home. There's no money there. There's no opportunities for them. And so I think we've got to, as a society, work out how it is that we actually give kids the opportunities and the motivation. Because if they're motivated, they're not going to lead their way into drugs necessarily. You know, they're going to see that their life can be a lot more than that. So we're quite serious about that issue, and we're going to get, you know, and sort of deeply involved. The other thing I'd say to you in that whole space is that actually we've got to give in my opinion, the youth court and potentially the family court much wider options actually for dealing with young offenders. At the moment we're in a situation where they literally get sort of nothing or, you know, get locked up. There's not a lot in between. And we've talked a lot about the army-style correction camps, and I personally think that they are very effective things to do, partly because they set structure and boundaries and discipline. And when you integrate them with literacy and numeracy, when you integrate them with mentoring, all of those things, they can be very, very effective. On Monday night at Premier House, we actually had a dinner where we invited a whole lot of people from around the country, everywhere from Andrew Beecroft, the Chief Youth Court Judge, right through to Judge Henwood, who many of you will know, right through to someone like Steve Boxer, who's running the sort of courses